Hello and welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to pick up where we left off. So previously, we'd looked at the appearance panel, we'd looked at how to arrange and align things on screen. And so now we're going to look at some of the other tools, including transform and blends and some other things, so we can look at how we can do further manipulation and duplicate images and things like that. So to start with, we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at some of the tools for like rotating and things like that. So we're going to go ahead and create a star. So I'm going to go to the star tool, create a star, and you can put any fill or stroke on it that you want. I'm just going to go ahead and go with something that I know will stand out on the screen. So it's a little bit easier to see. And maybe that blue will work against that white background. That'll be fine. Okay, so we've got our star, and we've kind of just sort of slapped it on the screen here. Some of the tools that we've got available just from having a star put on screen, right, are we have an ability to rotate the star. We can expand it or contract it, right, uniformly or not uniformly. And those are some basic transforms. Now, there's a bunch of other possibilities for how we can transform an object and how we can rotate it. So let's go ahead and start looking at those. If we come over to the tools over here, you're going to see that there's one that looks like a rotation, surprisingly enough, is called rotate. One here is called scale, right? These are tools that we already essentially have access to here, but what these tools do is they give us a little bit more freedom to do things. So if I select my rotate tool, you'll see that there's this little anchor point here, right? It's not that center point. It's a little bit off center from the center of the star, but it's this little blue icon right there. What I can do with rotate is I can click once and I can move that star anywhere that I want to rotate around. And then if I click and drag, my star is going to rotate around that point, right? This is really useful if we're aligning something, or if we want something to rotate, instead of around the center of the object, like if I wanted it to rotate, say, basically around this point here, right? I can click there and then I can rotate it this way, right? Really useful tool. The same thing more or less goes for the scale tool. I should be able to drop a point and then click and drag, and I can scale from that point, right? So again, this allows me to really sort of pin some part of the artwork to the artboard, and then I can go ahead and make it larger, do whatever I need to do from that point, right? Which is really, really useful. Underneath these tools, there's a couple other tools. There's the reflect tool, and there is the shear tool, and then the reshaper tool. And so let's go ahead and look at the reflect tool first. So with the reflect tool, I've already got a point dropped here. If I click, what this is going to do is it looks like it's rotating, but it's actually sort of reflecting the object around that point. And I don't know how better to show it unless we actually make this object not uniform. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go ahead and use our direct selection tool, the white arrow or the letter A. And I'm just going to grab, I'm going to deselect everything. I'm going to select this one anchor point, and I'm just going to round this one corner, right? So we have some sense of this shape not being uniform. So now that I've done that, I'm going to go back to the selection tool. I'm going to come down here to the reflect, and I'm just going to click and drag. And I want you to see it flipped that part over, right? So now this part that was on this side is now on this side. And it wasn't that it rotated around, it's that it actually flipped it. If I go to the shear tool and click and drag, you'll see what shear does, right? It kind of stretches things out in a strange way. That can be really useful if you're attempting to take some artwork and maybe make it look like it's laying on the page of a book, or on a wall or something like that. It can be really useful to be able to use shear to make some subtle changes like that, to do some perspective shifts and stuff like that. We've done shear. Now there's other ways we can reach transform tools. And one of the other ways we can reach our transform tools is by right-clicking, if we use direct selection, right-clicking on the object, and we can go down all the way down here by where arrange is. You'll see transform. And we have a whole bunch of options here. We have move, rotate, reflect, scale, shear, etc. And so here, if I go ahead and select one of these, like let's say I select reflect, The difference is that I'm going to get this window that pops up, and it's going to ask me if I want to do it at an angle, if I want to do it vertical or horizontal. So if I click on this, right, and preview is check marked, if you have preview check marked, it should update every time you do this. And so it allows you to have like a bit more precise control. You can also copy this. So you can leave your original. And then if you hit copy, you actually get two copies, one that's been reflected, one that's not. That's really handy if you're trying to make pairs of things. I'm going to go ahead and delete that for now. The same goes for any of the other tools. If I right click again, go down to transform, and let's say I go to rotate, right? I can basically very directly set what angle I want to rotate this. And then, I can hit OK, or I can hit copy, and I can get a second copy of that. So that's some other transform tools. And there's another transform tool that's hidden away as well. And well, it's not hidden away. Actually, for me, it's right up top. It might be hidden for you because it may by default be under the free transform tool. And the free transform tool, you'll see it has several different options up here. And some of those allow us to, right, again, I can rotate. I can come over here and I can start to stretch things this way. I can, stretch things this way. But along with those, I can also click here and I can grab each of these individual corners, and I can have a much more precise way of working with perspective, right? I can work at perspective in this way. And then this is the free distort, which basically allows me to move these points completely independently of one another, and really, tweak this artwork in all sorts of different ways. So that's one of the other tools. And then the final one I want to show, and I'm going to go ahead and undo all of that so it's a little bit more straight. Sure. The last one I want to show in terms of transform is the free puppet warp tool. If I select that, you'll see that we get several of these points and this mesh that appears on top of the surface of our object. If we hover over any of these points and click and drag, we essentially are going to be able to manipulate this thing like it's a piece of rubber. If you've used Photoshop before and you've used the Puppet Warp tool in Photoshop, it works very similarly. If you've used Puppet Warp in After Effects, again, very similar tool. This is just Illustrator's implementation, and you can get some pretty wild results with it. You can also add your own points. So I could add a point here. I can click and drag. I can't remember if there's any other options. Yeah, if I hold down Control and click on a point, it may let me rotate it, but in this case, for whatever reason, it is not letting me rotate that point. I don't know why. No, I can just select, and then, yeah, I should just be able to hit delete to delete a point. So, so this is a way, again, you can have a lot of power over manipulating your shape in any sort of strange form you might be interested in. I'm going to go ahead and leave this like this. It kind of looks like a bird. Maybe I'll add a couple more points here and here. And you'll see when you add more points, it subtly changes how the mesh is applied. But yeah, it should be pretty good. Okay, so, and why not just really turn this star into something that's not a star whatsoever. Okay, so we've got this shape, whatever this is, and we've done our our work doing our transforms, right? So we've got this object transformed. Now, I want to show you one of the kind of cool things you can do with some of the transform tools in terms of making patterns and multiples and very easily making somewhat complex things using simple shapes. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're just going to create an ellipse for this. We're going to make it really simple. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to hold down Shift so it's a circle. And then what I'd like to do is I'm going to make the fill transparent. And I'm going to go ahead and change the stroke to something that's a little more just easier to see against the background. So I'll use this blue. I'm going to leave it as a pretty thick line for the time being. Okay, now that I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and zoom out a little bit. I'm just going to bring this a little bit more close to the center. So I'm going to leave this, I'm centered in the artboard, but I'm going to leave it offset for a little bit. And what I would like to do is make this, what I want to do is I want to have a bunch of these circles that are sort of intersecting and rotated around in a circle, right? Like I'd like one maybe every 10 degrees or something for an entire circle. So there's one way that I can do this that creates a bunch of individual objects and allows me to have some more freedoms than the other option, and we'll look at both of them. So to start with, if I go ahead and have my circle selected, and I go to my rotate tool, I can either access it here, and then let's say I put my center of rotation. Actually, let's put it a little bit closer. It's going to be right about here. And once I've done that, I can click and drag to do a certain amount of degrees of rotation, or I can double click on this. And now you can see that it actually rearranged where that center was. So that's not great. So what I would like to do instead of doing that is hold down Option while I set this point. And when I do that, what that's going to do is it's going to pop up the dialog box so I can actually set this more precisely. So let's say I said I wanted it to be 10 degrees. So I'm going to say 10 degrees. Once I do that, you'll notice I have to click on something to get it to set that. Now I know 10 degrees is what I want. If I uncheck preview and then recheck preview, you can see it nudges it a little bit. And what I want to do is, instead of just saying, okay, I don't want to just move this. What I want to do is I want to create a copy. And once I've done that, if I was to go ahead and use my direct selection tool and I was to right click, you can see that under transform, one of my options here is transform again, which is Command D, right? We're going to go ahead and do this just by using Command or Control D if you're in Windows. And what that does is it's going to duplicate the last act that I did. So if I just keep hitting Command D, I can very quickly create an interlocking set of circles, right? That's pretty fantastic. Each one of these is an independent object. And so what that means is if I select this entire thing, right, all of these different pieces, and I was to say, put a fill in there, and then go ahead and go to my opacity for these objects, and change this from normal to say multiply, right? I can get a much different effect. So I essentially have that fill. It looks like the fill's in the background. I could do overlay, right? I can do all sorts of different options here to create different end results. Difference is kind of cool because these are exactly the same colors. So we get this really bizarre overlay pattern that's kind of beautiful, kind of garish with the colors I chose, but we can always try to make things a little bit better with some of these other colors, right? We've got this nice pattern happening here now, right? So this is one way that we can create multiples like that. One of the other tools we can use to do that is, again, let's create an ellipse. So I've created this circle, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the direct selection tool, make sure I have this selected, and unfortunately, what I want to do is not available under right-clicking. I can't get here to get there. So I want to show you where you find some of these things in the menu. If you go up to the menu at the top of the screen, there's the Object menu. The Object menu has a lot of the stuff that when you right-click, you can access too, like transform, arrange, align, distribute. All of that is available up there. There's a bunch, and then there's a bunch of other options. One of those options is repeat. And repeat allows us to do a radial repeat, a grid, or a mirror. And there's some options as well. So if I have this object selected and I click radial, what that's going to do is it's going to create this object that's essentially a group of copies of this one object. And it allows me to actually manipulate the rotation and how far spread apart these are, how much they overlap. I can also only do a part of a circle if I click on that little icon there, right? So you can kind of see that it allows me to have some freedom in terms of the number of clones. I can also increase by clicking on this, decrease the number of clones or increase the number of clones to whatever my heart desires. And so you can see that there's a lot of freedom there. Now, if I go ahead and change some of these settings, let's see what we get. Right, so I've got this, and if I go to my opacity here, again, I can go down and I should be able to say multiply. Now I want you to note that this isn't changing the same way, right? And what's actually happening here, if I was to go, let's just go ahead and do difference, which, right, it's treat instead of this being something that's happening to each individual copy, what it's doing is it's doing applying to it as though it's one singular object. And so that's one of the limitations of this tool. Right. So now if I was to overlay this on top of this, you can see that, right, it is indeed doing it is indeed doing what it's supposed to do, but it's doing it as a whole object instead of the individual clones acting upon one another. And so that's something that's kind of a limitation with this. And it really depends on what you're attempting to do and what you're hoping to do with it. Let's look at some of the other modes. I'm going to go ahead and just create some other shape, like let's just do a polygon. I'm going to hold down Shift. And again, I'm going to go back up to the object menu. I'm going to come down to repeat, and I'm going to say grid, right? Surprisingly enough, it made a grid. And I can adjust the spacing between each one of these grid rows. I want you to note that I can pull this down, right? I can also pull this side out so I can get more rows and columns visible. But again, yes, you can adjust these settings so you can create actually kind of interesting patterns pretty quickly with the grid. Okay, so that's one of the other options is the grid. If I decide that I don't want this grid to be active, I still have this thing selected and I can go to object. I can go back down to, where is it? Back down to repeat, and I can say release, right? And so if I click release, then it's just going to go back to the one object that I've got. So let's go ahead and quickly look at the other option here. So mirror is the other repeat option, right? And basically what it's doing is it gives you a line and it allows you to mirror the geometry that you're working with. So in this case, I can rotate this off. I can bring it on. There are certain cases where this would be really, really useful, right? For this object, I don't think it's necessarily all that useful, but what's kind of cool is I can mirror it and then it actually kind of covers up that line segment between them. So if I, you'll see I'm in isolation mode right now. If I double click out of this, right, I've mirrored these things, but now that geometry appears to be one cohesive piece, which is actually a really nice feature that this mode has. Let's try and mirror this as well. Why not? Let's just go ahead and say object, repeat, mirror. And then you can rotate this however you'd like, but you can kind of see that it actually goes through and it'll actually kind of cover everything up entirely. Or I could say set it like this. So that's mirroring, right? That's repeating things. There's all sorts of different ways we can repeat things here. And so I'd like to show some other ways we can create some multiples pretty quickly. So I'm just moving all this artwork off to the side. Oops. And I just moved one of those individual rings. One thing you might want to do for this massive donut of color is to actually go ahead and click and drag to select it all and then hit Command or Control G to group that into one thing. So now we have this as a group and we can move it more easily out of the way. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at blends. So I'm gonna create another polygon, and then I'm gonna use the blob brush. And I'm going to deselect the polygon first, and then I'm going to use the blob brush. And I'm going to expand the size of the brush some. I can use the opening or closing brackets to do that. And if for some reason that is not working, I can double click on the blob brush and I can scale the size up here. I'm going to hit OK. And I'm just going to make a blobby shape. And I want to have it filled in because that's just going to make life easier for this. So all right, so I've got this shape, and let's go ahead and put a different colored stroke on the outside. We'll do green, and let's just boost the number of points on that to something substantial. Okay, so now I've got this shape, and I want to make a blend to this shape. So I'm going to select these two objects, and I'm going to go to Object, I'm going to go down to Blend, and I'm going to say Make. And what you're going to see is a smooth transition between these two shapes. So I want you to note that I'm getting this gradient from the stroke, right, going green to red. And then the fill of this is totally hidden at this point. And then I have my other object here. And what's nice about this too is this is a group that if I double click on it, and I select the end of this path, right, I can essentially adjust the position of these objects, right? And so then if for some reason your blend doesn't look like this, if you go up to object, I'm going to show you the other mode, because sometimes what happens is it decides to um, go be preset to one mode or the other. So I'm going to select blend options. And I want you to note that there's these smooth color is one option. Specified steps is one of the options. Notice 236 is the default. That's going to give you that smooth color. But if I just set this to say 10, and then uncheck preview and recheck preview, you can see that what it's going to do is it's going to create this stepped process here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave it in the stepped mode just so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. If I hit OK and I'm still in, right, I've double clicked on my blend, so I'm inside the blend group, and I use my pen tool, the plus sign, what I can do is I can actually go into this path between these two objects. I can add a point, and then I can use the letter A or the direct selection tool up here to click on that point and drag this around and use this just like any other spline. I can make a little bit of a bend here if I wanted to. I could actually go ahead and turn this into a smooth anchor point, right? So I can have handles. I can adjust things this way. And this allows me to have a lot of freedom over how I blend these two objects together. And it allows you to create some really cool geometry. Now, the other thing is I can actually select the objects in the blend. And so if I wanted to use my direct selection, and I say I want to rotate this a bit because I wasn't happy with the orientation, right? I can rotate these objects and it updates pretty much in real time. This tool can be really, really handy for a lot of different use cases. And so I wanted to show y'all how to make this. And if I double click off in space somewhere, now I can move this whole thing as a group. And again, you can do all sorts of cool things. Like if one of these is transparent and the other one is opaque, or if the stroke actually changes thickness. So if I was to double click on this and set the stroke width to, I don't know, 100 or something like that, right? You'll see that it goes from small and it rapidly increases in size as it goes. One of the other neat things you can do is that expand tool. If I select this whole object, and I go to object and go down to expand, and I'm not going to expand the fill or stroke. I just want to expand the object. I'm going to hit OK. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to select any of these intermediary objects, right? So I can double click, I can select any one of these, and I could either now move these independently of one another, or maybe there's just one in the middle that I'm happy with that shape and I want to use that some other way in the artwork. So that's pretty cool, right? And pretty much any object can be part of a blend. There may be some limitations, like if you have a gradient fill, it may be angry about that. It may be limited to solid fills. That's something you can experiment with and see if it works or not. Okay, so those are blends, right? That's another way to create repetition. All right, so let's go ahead and look at, there's one other object that I really wanted, or one other option I really wanted to show in this tutorial, and as a way to do some interesting things, and it's called intertwine. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create two ellipses. For the time being. Oh man, those are really hard to see. Let's go ahead and make it more vibrant. And we're just going to do the stroke. We're going to turn off the fill on this, and I'm just going to create one more that's going vertically, and I'm going to change the stroke color to something else that's going to stand out against that. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my selection tool, the letter V on the keyboard, select both of those objects, go to object, go down to intertwine and say make. Now, nothing has happened. And that's because we haven't told it where to do the intertwining yet. And what intertwining allows us to do is I can hover over one of these intersections, and if I click, it's going to bring the background object into the foreground in that place. And if I was to come over here and click again, right? So now it looks like these two objects are intertwined. This is a really handy feature if you've ever tried to do this manually. It's kind of obnoxious and a total nightmare. And it's just really nice to be able to do this and have this be an option. Now, when there are fills involved, it gets a little weird. So if I was to go ahead and double click and select one of these objects and add a fill, I want you to see that, right, the fill is not being overlapped, and you can actually kind of choose as well. Like I was just selecting this, but if we were to, let's turn the fill off real quick. One of the other, and double click to get out of this. If I select the intertwine object and go down here and go back to intertwine and say edit, then I can come in and I can say, oh, I want to flip this one around. But note that this is a lasso as well. So I could more manually like circle something as well to do an intertwine. But when I do that, if I go back and select one of these objects, like say I select this object and I put a fill in there, you're going to see that it actually, wherever I circled is where it's going to come through the fill. Now that could be really, really useful in certain cases, but that's just something to note, that fills are a little bit strange with with how the intertwining happens. But if I wanted that to feel like a thread that's kind of being sewn through the object, I could go down and I could also do something similar here so it feels like it's dipping in and out. But so that's intertwine, right? So that's a pretty cool little option. It's not it's a tool that you're not going to use every day, but it's something that if you want interwoven artwork, it's a really simple way to make that happen. So that is kind of a lot of the coverage of how to make multiples. The next section of this tutorial, we're going to look specifically at how to create patterns using artwork generated in Illustrator.